Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Four Rooms from 1995. Now, Four Rooms has been, as with many things, I'm going to keep saying this, aren't I? Has been on my list for a while. Something I forgot about for a long time, but part of the reason I watched it was because it is set on New Year's Eve of whatever year. Doesn't particularly matter. It is an interesting it's an interesting film in that it is an anthology film, of which in the mainstream there are not very many, and also because of the talents behind it, both in directorship and in actors. It's got quite the ensemble cast, laundry list of characters, lots of good actors, a few bad ones too, but we'll leave those aside. It is written and directed by four different people. There's four kind of five scenes written in conjunction with one another, but individually written and directed by individual people. The biggest name on here is, of course, Quentin Tarantino. However, also has his frequent collaborator, Robert Rodriguez, and then two lesser-known writer and directors, Allison Anders and Alexandre Rockwell. I don't know how to pronounce his name. The other two don't have a lot of credits to their name, not a lot of Hollywood experience, but that doesn't mean they're, necessarily less worthy of being on the ticket. Anthology films are interesting. I actually was trying to think of the last one I watched, and I actually couldn't think of one really, other than arguably you could talk about Grindhouse, the Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez sort of double feature / anthology film that they did a couple of years ago. Oh man, when was that? It's probably like 10 or 15 years ago now. I'm so old. But anthology films are not that common. That said, I really like them for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it tends to drive a certain sort of format. And that is small, cheap, limited scope, which are all things I've talked about before that I think are good conditions for people to work under. Because the more freedom you have, the more likely you are to get a little crazy with it and make some mistakes. Whereas if you've got very limited capabilities, you're likely to nail down only exactly what you can do and execute on that probably pretty well. This is certainly old enough that it did not at the time have the same draw that it might now based on the names. Tarantino had already made, a bunch of successful films, but with him not being, straight on the, it's not his movie, I don't think that necessarily drew a lot to it. As far as I'm aware, the movie performed very poorly. Although it did make its money back. Allegedly cost $4 million to make and allegedly made $4.25 million back at the box office. So, what can you do? Like I said, I think it's a great thing that they have a very limited budget. And I really like what they did here. The overall plot is essentially that it's from the perspective, ? Of the bellhop of a sort of rundown hotel who is working the night at this hotel and running into the characters who are in attendance. as crazy as they may be. This leads to, I hesitate to say hijinks because that implies a certain level of goofiness, but it is in many ways a dark comedy in terms of its overall tone. That said, between the various scenes, and it's basically one scene per room, more or less, there's a lot of variability. Overall, each of them are pretty good. I would say the first one is arguably the weakest, but it's not without its merits. And so to see these individual, 15 to 20 minute scenes with very limited budgets, very limited scope, and relying basically on the actors, along with some limited help from camera work and costuming and sets. I think it turns out something really interesting. Now, unfortunately, over the whole arc of the thing, I don't know if it necessarily comes down to a cohesive whole, and whether or not that was necessarily the intention or not is a little bit up in the air. The various scenes do tie together directly, but whether or not it's in a meaningful way, I would say it's not really. But it paints enough of a sort of picture that I don't think it doesn't work. Like I said, ensemble cast, Tim Roth plays the bellhop. There's quite the laundry list of other notable actors here. Antonio Banderas, a whole bunch of other. He's like probably the most notable. What's his name? Bruce Willis, I believe, is in one of the. Is that Bruce Willis? I actually didn't double check. It seems to be. Hold on. It is. Okay. I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to look like an idiot there. Anyway, a bunch of other notable actors and actresses, sort of all over the place here, and none of them are taking it too crazy seriously, which I really appreciate. Adds to that sort of dark comedy hijinks tone. At the same time, I do have an appreciation for leaning a little bit into the sort of absurdist, existentialist stuff, and this varies between the individual directors, but sort of touching on the likes of Beckett and Pinter, not only in sort of the themes, but in the scope, working in these very limited scopes, very limited settings, and keeping to sort of how do I put this? Keeping it within itself, if that makes sense. If you're not really much of a theater person, that may not make sense. But if you've watched Beckett and Pinter and other like existentialists and absurdists, it will probably kind of make sense. Anyway, as I was watching it overall, there were moments where I wavered and went, I'm not sure if this is working. But certainly by the end, I felt like each one of the scenes came together in a way that was meaningful and interesting. There are a couple of actors who don't do a great job, but for the most part, they do. Tim Roth is great throughout the entire thing, although his engagement directly and indirectly varies over the various directorships. I think probably the strongest, most consistent thing is probably the writing. I don't know how much the various writers and directors had to do with each other's scenes, how much influence they had on each other's writing. But there's enough cohesive there that it's not at all jarring when they switch from one to the other. And if I didn't already know that that was the case for the film, I don't think I would have assumed that was necessarily the case. More that they were just going for different stylistic choices for each room. So ultimately, like I said, I'm not sure if it comes together into a really wonderful, cohesive whole. It's not the prettiest thing by any means. It doesn't have the best acting you've ever seen. It doesn't have the best sets or costumes or anything like that. It doesn't tell a great story. But overall, for like 90 minutes worth of film, I was pretty pleased with it. It's a good, entertaining watch. As long as you're not, as long as you are alone or in company that is not likely to take easy offense to, the typical blood, sex, violence, whatever, that is common with Tarantino and Rodriguez and others. It's very frank in those sorts of themes. It's not excessive, but it's not hiding anything either. So, like, as far as spending 90 minutes watching something, you could certainly do much worse. I would say there are things that are much better made overall that I've gotten quite a lot less enjoyment out of. So even though there are some things that certainly bring this down in overall quality, my overall enjoyment is much higher than that scoring alone would suggest. So it should not be overlooked, I don't think. It's even the child actors, which I was iffy on throughout some of the scenes, were ultimately redeemed in a way that I really appreciated. So again, another point on good directing and good casting. Anyway, it's hard to talk about this film in a concise and cohesive way. Hopefully you got something out of this rambling, and you could spend 90 minutes doing worse things. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next year for something else.